Hello and welcome to this week's video lecture. The topic we will be covering today will be ethical approaches to leadership. Within this section, we will start by looking at the ethical approaches to leadership. These are the new and emerging paradigms of leadership. There are many of them, and it will almost be impossible to examine all at this level. However, we will be looking at the most popular of these approaches. These are servant leadership, authentic leadership, ethical leadership, and distributed. The first theory we will be examining within this approach is the servant leadership theory. Servant leadership theory represents a radical shift from the perception of a leader as an all-knowing individual to that of a selfless servant. It emerged from religion with well-known examples of Jesus Christ in Christianity and Muhammad in Islam. There is an increasing concern in management research that in order to succeed as an organization, people need to be empowered and the long-term welfare of the followers must come first. This is the basis of servant leadership. Servant leadership itself is a paradoxical concept because people view servants and leaders as entirely different people, and it can be difficult to conceptualize an individual as being both at the same time. The root of this type of leadership is grounded in the works of Greenleaf, 1977. According to Greenleaf, 1998, page 19, the servant leader is servant first. It begins with the natural feeling that one wants to serve first. Then conscious choices bring one to aspire to lead. That person is sharply different from one who is leader first, perhaps because of the need to assuage an unusual power or to acquire material possessions. Servant leaders put their service before self-interest, earn trust by being trustworthy, help others to discover themselves, and listen actively to the problems of the group rather than impose their will on others. The focus of this type of leadership is similar to stewardship and has been used synonymously with spiritual leadership. However, unlike stewardship, which involves empowerment of employees, servant leadership goes further and calls for the highest level of selflessness. In recent years, there has been a growing interest in the acceptance and application of servant leadership theory, first proposed by Robert Greenleaf. Scholars such as Russell and Stone, 2002, Sanjaya and Saros, 2002, Smith et al., 2004, and Spears, 1998, have contributed significantly to advancing our understanding of this approach. Spears, 1998 in particular, outlined 10 core characteristics that define a servant leader: listening, empathy, healing, awareness, persuasion, conceptualization, foresight, stewardship, commitment to the growth of people, and community building. Although servant leadership may have once been considered relatively obscure, it has continued to capture attention well into the 21st century. Russell, 2016. Sanjaya and Saros, 2002. Academics, practitioners, and researchers alike remain fascinated by its paradoxes and promises, particularly its potential to balance humility with effectiveness. Stone et al., 2004. The theory continues to be recognized as a vital area of study because of its demonstrated contribution to organizational success and development. Harrison, 2018. Since its inception, servant leadership has undergone continuous refinement and evolution, with contemporary research expanding its relevance across diverse contexts and organizational settings. In this activity, we will be exploring the concept of servant leadership through the lens of a real-world example. The goal is to move beyond theory and critically analyze how servant leadership operates in practice. To begin, you are asked to research and identify a specific leader who is widely recognized as a servant leader. This could be someone within your own workplace, perhaps a manager, supervisor, or organizational leader, or a well-known public figure such as Howard Schultz of Starbucks, Jacinda Ardern, or Mahatma Gandhi. The key is to choose someone whose leadership style clearly reflects the core values of servant leadership. Once you've selected your leader, the next step is to critically analyze their actions, decisions, and overall impact. Ask yourself, how did this leader embody the principles of servant leadership? Look for specific examples of behaviors or initiatives that demonstrate their commitment to service, empathy, empowerment, and ethical decision-making. You should also consider the positive outcomes of their leadership. Did their approach lead to higher employee engagement, stronger community relationships, or organizational success? Reflect on the tangible and intangible ways their servant leadership made a difference. However, a critical analysis also requires balance. Think about the challenges or criticisms associated with their leadership style. Were there instances where their servant approach was misunderstood, ineffective, or even counterproductive? Did their focus on serving others create any limitations or unintended consequences, such as decision-making delays or lack of assertiveness? Finally, bring this reflection closer to home. Consider whether this style of leadership would work effectively in your own workplace. Would the organizational culture, structure, or expectations support a servant leadership model, or would it require adaptation? Once you've completed your analysis, post your responses to Aula to share your insights with your peers. This discussion will help deepen our collective understanding of servant leadership and how it functions in different real-world contexts. Although servant leadership has been praised for its practical nature and its potential to enhance organizational effectiveness, there are several shortcomings to this approach. While it has gained recognition in the literature, there remains insufficient empirical evidence to fully justify its validity. Much of what we know about servant leadership is based on anecdotal accounts and case studies of historical figures. Well-known examples often include Jesus Christ, Muhammad, and other spiritual leaders. However, most of these accounts are descriptive in nature and have not been rigorously tested through either qualitative or quantitative research methodologies. Because of this lack of empirical testing, a number of researchers, such as Barbuto and Wheeler, 2006, Laub et al., 1999, Liddon et al., 2008, and Page and Wong, 2000, have developed their own constructs to define servant leadership. The diversity of these constructs highlights an important issue. Scholars conceptualize and measure servant leadership in very different ways. This inconsistency demonstrates the pressing need for a more uniform and standardized approach to measuring the phenomenon. A second major criticism concerns the efficacy of servant leadership across different organizational settings. Some argue that servant leadership theories overlook the practical demands that organizations face, particularly in business contexts where stakeholder welfare and customer satisfaction often take priority over employee interests. Furthermore, servant leadership offers little clarity on how a leader might cope when making difficult decisions, such as downsizing or restructuring, in order to improve performance. In today's fast-changing and turbulent business environment, critics suggest that servant leadership may not be the most appropriate model for dynamic or high-pressure contexts. It is also important to acknowledge that servant leadership has its detractors. Because of its spiritual and biblical connotations, it is often associated with religious leadership rather than business practice. Torish and Pinnington, 2002, for instance, argue that the concept is too spiritual to be applied effectively in organizational settings. Others, such as Kim et al. 2014, question the very possibility of Anderson 2009, further argues that servant leaders pursue common goals that may not necessarily benefit all organizations, while Bradley 1999 highlights that in hierarchical systems, followers are inherently servants, and leadership authority is granted by followers themselves. However, one could counter this by pointing out that in authoritarian or dictatorial leadership, followers rarely have such agency, raising further complexity around how servant leadership operates in practice. In order to evaluate servant leadership fairly, it is essential to consider these criticisms alongside its strengths. This chapter will therefore explore both supportive and opposing perspectives through a systematic review of the existing literature. It should also be noted that not all scholars agree with the criticisms. Some argue that servant leadership is in fact essential for organizational success. Researchers such as Bausch 1998 and Senjaya and Saros 2002 believe that without servant leadership, organizations risk becoming dysfunctional and unproductive, creating toxic work environments that undermine collaboration, trust, and long-term performance. Authentic leadership is one of the most recent developments in leadership research. As its name implies, this approach focuses on whether leaders are truly genuine and authentic in their actions and relationships with others. The concept gained widespread recognition around 2003 and has since attracted significant theoretical attention. It continues to be a prominent topic not only in academic discussions but also among practitioners seeking to understand and apply more ethical and transparent leadership practices. The rise of authentic leadership theory was largely a response to a crisis of trust in leadership, especially following corporate scandals in organizations such as Enron and within the banking sector. These events led to an increased demand for leadership models that embody integrity, transparency, and accountability. As a result, the concept of authentic leadership emerged as a framework for rebuilding trust and credibility within organizations. Over the past decade, this area has become a key focus in major academic journals, including Leadership Quarterly, the Journal of Management Studies, and the European Management Journal. It is important to note that authentic leadership research remains largely formative, meaning that the concept is still being developed and refined. The theory itself arose in part from the perceived ethical shortcomings of transformational leadership. Although transformational leadership has been praised for its motivational qualities, many scholars have questioned its moral foundations. Critics argue that transformational leaders can manipulate followers in pursuit of personal or organizational goals. For example, Howell and Avolio, 1992, provided empirical evidence supporting the controversial claim that transformational leaders do not necessarily have to be ethical in order to be effective. In response to such concerns, Bass and Steidelmeier, 2004, differentiated between authentic and pseudo-transformational leaders. They argued that while transformational leadership may include ethical ambiguity, authentic leadership is built on a foundation of moral integrity, self-awareness, and genuine relationships. In this sense, authentic leadership places ethics at the very heart of leadership practice, rather than treating it as an afterthought. Although there is no single, universally accepted definition of authentic leadership, most researchers agree on a set of core attributes that define authentic leaders. These essential components are self-awareness, internalized moral perspective, balanced processing, and relational transparency. Together, these elements form the foundation of what it means to lead authentically and ethically. The first attribute, self-awareness, refers to a leader's understanding of their own values, emotions, strengths, and limitations. Authentic leaders possess a deep sense of who they are and how their behavior affects others. They are reflective and open to feedback, continuously seeking to align their actions with their beliefs. Followers tend to view leaders with strong self-awareness as genuine and trustworthy, because such leaders demonstrate consistency between their words and their actions. The second element, internalized moral perspective, involves guiding one's behavior based on internal moral standards rather than external pressures or expectations. Authentic leaders are driven by their principles and integrity. They resist being swayed by popularity, politics, or short-term gain. Because of this, followers see them as reliable and morally grounded, leaders who act according to what they truly believe is right. The third component, balanced processing, refers to the leader's ability to evaluate information objectively. Authentic leaders do not make hasty decisions or rely solely on personal biases. Instead, they carefully consider multiple perspectives and actively seek input from others before arriving at a decision. This openness to diverse viewpoints fosters fairness, builds trust, and reinforces the perception that the leader acts in the best interest of the group rather than personal preference. Finally, relational transparency is about being open, genuine, and honest in one's interactions with others. It means showing one's true self, both strengths and vulnerabilities, and creating relationships built on authenticity rather than image. Followers connect most deeply with leaders who are real and approachable, who share both their successes and their challenges. When a leader is transparent in this way, it encourages mutual respect and fosters an environment of openness and trust. In essence, authentic leadership is not about perfection, but about self-awareness, moral integrity, fairness, and honesty. It's about leading from a place of truth, allowing followers to see and believe in the genuine person behind the title. While authentic leadership has been praised for its emphasis on self-awareness, ethics, and transparency, it is not without its shortcomings. Despite the value it brings to leadership studies, several key criticisms have emerged that challenge its theoretical and practical foundations. One major criticism concerns the inclusion of a moral dimension in authentic leadership. Some scholars question whether morality should be a defining characteristic of the theory at all. There have been cases where leaders, though highly self-aware and seemingly authentic, have still behaved in ways that are inconsistent or even unethical. This raises doubts about whether self-awareness alone guarantees ethical or effective leadership. Egli, 2005, offers an important perspective on this issue, arguing that authenticity must be acknowledged by followers in order to produce positive outcomes. In other words, it is not enough for a leader to simply believe they are authentic. Their authenticity must also be perceived and validated by others. This highlights that authentic leadership is inherently two-dimensional and relational. It exists within the interactions and perceptions between leaders and followers, not just within the individual leader. Another limitation is the lack of empirical evidence supporting the theory. Although authentic leadership has attracted substantial theoretical attention, there remains a shortage of rigorous, data-driven research to confirm its effectiveness. Much of the existing literature is conceptual or exploratory, meaning that claims about the impact of authentic leadership are often based on assumptions rather than robust findings. Finally, there is still uncertainty about whether authentic leadership is effective across different contexts and cultures. The concept may not translate easily into all organizational or cultural settings, particularly in environments where transparency or emotional expression is not valued or encouraged. This ongoing question underscores the need for further research to test the adaptability and validity of authentic leadership in diverse and dynamic contexts. In summary, while authentic leadership provides a compelling moral and psychological framework, its limitations, particularly around moral consistency, follower perception, empirical support, and contextual flexibility, continue to pose challenges to its universal acceptance. Ethical leadership is a leadership approach that emphasizes the moral responsibilities of leaders and the ethical implications of their decisions. It involves leaders carefully considering how their actions and choices affect others, particularly the employees and stakeholders within their organization. Mihalich et al., 2010. At its core, ethical leadership is about doing what is right, fair, and just, even when doing so may not be the easiest or most profitable option. Although the concept has sometimes been criticized for being vague or overly idealistic, it is generally understood as the practice of enabling people to do the right thing. Ethical leaders model integrity through their behavior, setting clear examples for others to follow. They do not merely enforce rules. Rather, they foster an environment in which ethical behavior becomes part of the organizational culture. Such leaders regularly question what is right and wrong, and, through that reflection, establish a clear code of conduct that guides both their own actions and those of their followers. An important distinction within this framework lies in how leadership and ethics are evaluated. Leadership is often judged by outcomes, that is, the results a leader achieves, such as profitability, efficiency, or organizational growth. Ethics, however, is judged by intentions, by whether the leader's motives and decision-making processes are morally sound. As Trevino and Brown 2000 note, a leader may act with good ethical intentions, but the outcomes of those actions can still be amoral or even harmful. This tension underscores the complexity of ethical leadership. Having moral intent does not always guarantee moral results. Ethical leadership also requires a balance between moral conviction and practical judgment. In many situations, leaders face competing demands, for example, maintaining profitability while also ensuring employee well-being. The ethical leader must navigate these dilemmas with transparency and fairness, ensuring that decisions are not only effective but also morally defensible. Furthermore, ethical leadership extends beyond compliance with rules or regulations. It calls for moral courage, the willingness to challenge unethical practices even when it is unpopular or risky to do so. Ethical leadership is typically judged based on outcomes, whether success, targets, or performance. Ethics, however, is judged by intentions, the moral reasoning and motivation behind one's actions. As Trevino and Brown point out, even when a leader's intentions are ethical, the results of their actions can still be amoral or ethically questionable. This distinction reveals one of the central challenges of ethical leadership. Good intentions do not always lead to good outcomes. Another key issue is that many leaders lack clear guidance on how to act ethically. Research finds that a large proportion of adults are not fully informed about ethics and often lack the ability to make morally autonomous decisions, that is, to reason ethically and act on their own moral judgment. The same limitation applies to leaders who may face complex ethical dilemmas without sufficient moral frameworks or training to navigate them effectively. Moreover, a leader's ethical stance is often complicated by conflicting loyalties to multiple stakeholders. leaders must balance the expectations of shareholders, employees, customers, and the wider community, groups that may hold very different ethical priorities. These competing demands can create significant moral tension, making it nearly impossible for leaders to act in a way that satisfies all ethical perspectives simultaneously. Adding to this complexity is the issue of cultural relativity. What is considered ethical in one culture may not be viewed the same way in another. A leadership practice seen as fair and transparent in one context might be perceived as disrespectful or inappropriate elsewhere. These differences in moral frameworks can lead to ethical conflicts, both within the leader and among employees, especially in diverse or multinational organizations. Even when leaders strive to be ethical, they are not immune to external influences. They may be shaped and corrupted by the unethical behaviors and norms that exist within their organizational culture. Over time, exposure to such behavior can desensitize leaders to moral lapses, leading to a gradual erosion of ethical standards. Furthermore, ethical leadership has been criticized for its reliance on reward and punishment systems, which can introduce amoral or manipulative elements, similar to those found in transformational leadership. While ethical leadership aims to encourage moral behavior, it can inadvertently become transactional, where individuals act ethically only to gain rewards or avoid penalties, rather than from genuine moral conviction. Scholars argue that simply being perceived as ethical does not necessarily make a leader ethical in reality. Perceptions of morality can be shaped by charisma, image, or communication style rather than by authentic ethical behavior. Compounding this issue is the ambiguity of the concept itself. There remains no single universally accepted definition of what constitutes ethical leadership. Another way of conceptualizing leadership that has emerged in recent years is that of distributed leadership. The term distributed leadership has been used interchangeably with terms such as shared leadership, team leadership, participative leadership, and democratic leadership by some researchers. It is a type of leadership that involves interaction between people and their situation. Spillane, 2005. Leadership is dispersed among all members and is not merely a function of a single leader's action. Distributed leadership does not involve a single individual, but is a collective effort of the group. The traditional approach to understanding leadership examined it as a vertical process, whereby the individual's skills, traits, or behavior in different situations are important for effective leadership. Hence, there has been much research on ways of improving the skills and behaviors, or on influencing the context. The proponents of distributed leadership argue that it is impossible for an individual to have all the skills and knowledge necessary for effective leadership. Followers and the ways in which the leaders interact with them in different situations must also be considered. Distributed leadership is concerned with the interaction between people and the situations in which they find themselves. Rather than focusing on a single individual, distributed leadership focuses on the collective effort of a group. Distributed leadership proposes that it is not possible for a leader to possess all the skills and traits necessary for leadership across all situations. Rather, how leaders interact with their followers should be taken into consideration. Harris, 2010. It is also concerned with roles and responsibilities being distributed. Empirical research has shown that distributed leadership can have a positive effect on organizational performance, as it encourages collaboration, shared responsibility, and the use of diverse skills across a team. However, like many leadership theories, it also has notable shortcomings. One of the main challenges is accountability. When a single leader is in charge, it is clear who is responsible when things go wrong. But in a distributed leadership model, where responsibility is shared among several individuals, accountability can easily become blurred. If multiple people contribute to a project but no one oversees it fully, it becomes difficult to determine who is ultimately responsible for outcomes. Therefore, in any distributed leadership structure, it is essential to define roles, responsibilities, and expectations clearly to ensure accountability is maintained. Another limitation is that not everyone wants to lead. Distributed leadership assumes that leadership should be shared, but in practice, not all individuals are willing or equipped to take on leadership responsibilities. Some may lack confidence, motivation, or the necessary skill set to lead effectively, which can negatively affect both team performance and organizational outcomes. Beyond these practical challenges, distributed leadership has also been criticized for the way power dynamics can manifest within teams. Sinclair argued that distributed leadership may allow hegemonic behaviors to emerge, where dominant individuals overshadow others in decision-making processes. Similarly, Sugrue noted that this approach can lead to the silencing of quieter team members, whose contributions risk being ignored in favor of more vocal or prominent colleagues. Ripin further highlighted that distributed leadership can take on gendered dimensions, where the work and ideas of certain members, often women or those in less visible roles, are rendered invisible. These criticisms suggest that while distributed leadership may appear democratic, it can, in reality, reproduce existing inequalities within teams, if not managed carefully. In conclusion, although distributed leadership faces several challenges, it remains an appealing concept because it challenges the traditional notion that leadership is reserved for a select few.